All right, so we are back. Good to see you all. Happy Thanksgiving a day early. And let me just say at the very beginning of this show, lest you think that this is going to be a light Thanksgiving themed episode, appropriate topics to talk about with your family members who might be on the opposite side of the political spectrum. Well, you'd be wrong. This is not that episode. This is an episode I have been waiting to do for quite some time. Sometimes when we have very special guests, as we do today, it takes just a little bit of time to wiggle both of our schedules to fit an interview in. And I am delighted that we are finally going to talk to the man that I will introduce to you in just a moment, because we've been trying to make this happen for a couple of weeks now. But listen, you and I know we are partners in this endeavor on the Liz Wheeler Show. And we on the Liz Wheeler Show have been on the forefront for the past couple of months now of covering the networks of violent leftist groups in our country. Now, we know that these groups, when they take to the streets, it's not an organic protest. It's not a grassroots gathering of citizens airing their grievances against the government. It's nothing of the kind. These are highly coordinated, tied together, meaning connected. They are funded, these groups, by billionaires like communist Roy Singham and God-hating George Soros. And the umbrella of these groups, all of these groups together, and there are dozens and dozens of groups, from the People's Forum to the Party of Socialism and Liberation, to the John Brown Gun Club, to Armed Queers of Salt Lake City, to Behind Enemy Lines, so many of them. Those are just a couple that we've covered in the last couple months. They serve as a structure of camouflage for Antifa terrorists. Now, you know that Antifa, of course, loves to claim that they're a decentralized network. They have no organizational structure, no leadership. They're not really a group, they like to say, or at least that's what their mouthpieces in the mainstream media tell you. They're an idea. We have proved this to be demonstrably false. The umbrella of radical leftist groups that I mentioned, those names and many more, allow Antifa to exist quietly beneath them, like slugs under a rock. These groups, these leftist groups, provide Antifa militants quietly with resources, with training, with mobilization, and yes, with funding. All without Antifa poking their heads above ground. Until, of course, the Antifa militants wage their terror attacks against us. Now, one man in particular has been in the thick of it, on the front lines, infiltrating these violent thugs, these groups, for years to report on who they are and how they work and what their goals are, how they intend to subvert our country and harm you. And he suffered for it. In 2019 in Portland, Oregon, journalist Andy Ngo was brutally attacked by Antifa militants, sustaining a traumatic brain injury, a brain hemorrhage, as a result of that assault. He was then assaulted again by Antifa in 2021. They recognized him when he was reporting on one of their public riots. He was chased, he was attacked, he was beaten by a masked mob. He ended up ultimately fleeing to the Nines Hotel, where the mob surrounded the hotel, chanting and demanding his blood. Nobody has been closer to Antifa and reporting on the reality of what Antifa is, how they work, how to dismantle them, and what ultimately Antifa wants to do to our country than independent journalist Andy Ngo. And I am delighted to introduce you to him today. He's the author, of course, of a must-read book, Unmasked: Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy. If you want to understand this group, you will read that book. He also writes at a very cheekily titled Substack, Ngo Comment, spelled like his last name, ngocomment.com. Highly recommend his reporting over there. Andy, it is good to see you. Thank you for joining the show.
Thank you very much for having me on and for that introduction, Liz.
All right, so there's been a significant update. We know, of course, that President Trump designated Antifa as a terror organization. We all kind of sat back and said, okay, how is this going to play out? Like, what are the implications of this designation? And I think, Andy, you had an article recently that I'd like you to explain to us about the first Antifa terrorism convictions that we've seen following the Antifa attack, the shooting on the ICE facility in Alvarado, Texas. So if you wouldn't mind giving us a summary of what that attack was, who it was carried out by, and what these terrorism convictions mean in this fight against Antifa, I think that would be a great place to start.
Yeah, so I think I should discuss, like, how did we get to this point? So
Yep.
backtracking to September, a few days after Charlie Kirk was murdered, Donald Trump announced on Truth Social that his administration would be treating Antifa as domestic terrorists. And my sentiment at that time was, let's wait and see what this means. Because in 2020, a very similarly worded statement was posted on Trump's Twitter at that time. And Attorney General Barr and his administration in the last months that it was in office didn't do anything on that. But a lot has happened since that announcement in September. This time is very different. So there was a roundtable on Antifa at the White House, in which I was invited to speak face to face with the president, as well as other journalists who were invited, and members of his cabinet were there. There were 2 executive orders that he signed, basically formalizing in writing what he had wanted, that was first written in the Truth Social post. And then there were the foreign terrorist organization designations by the State Department on 4 international Antifa groups that have been involved in shootings, bombings, attempted murders in Europe. And then the most recent update is that in Texas, there's been an ongoing Antifa terror cell case, and that's being prosecuted at both the federal and the state level. And as of last week, 5 of 9 indicted members of the cell have pleaded guilty. And if you read the federal indictment against them, the DOJ does not mince any words. They're particularly North Texas Antifa cell. And in the stipulated facts as part of pleading guilty, which means that they agreed that these are the facts of the case, and they signed their names to it as part of the plea deal. They admitted to being part of an organized cell that organized around the Antifa ideology, and they were involved in a affinity group. And that's all the words of Antifa. That's how they describe their organized groups. And the 5 of them were convicted of providing material support to terrorists. And I cannot overstate how significant of a development this is. This is the first time, like in a period of 2 weeks, we had like 2 first-time evers in the U.S. history. We had, for the first time, the State Department formalizing that 4 Antifa groups internationally were terrorists on the level now officially designated like ISIS, Al-Qaeda. These are official designations from State Department. And then a federal case in Texas has resulted in terrorism convictions. So far, 5 people. At least 1 more is going to plead guilty. And there's a total of 18 defendants in this case. So it'll work its way through the courts. Also, they're also facing terrorism charges at the state level in Texas too, by the way. So, like, I'm just like, finally, we have this. At the same time, we're not seeing any coverage on liberal media. And I doubt that the minds of liberals who defend Antifa, that say that they're good guys or that they don't exist, their minds probably won't be changed. I mean, it wasn't changed when an Antifa gunman shot up an ICE facility in 2019 and tried blowing it up in Tacoma, Washington. It didn't change their mind. When a Trump supporter was assassinated by an Antifa gunman in downtown Portland in 2020, it didn't change their mind. When I was nearly killed several times, and other people have been maimed and injured through the streets of America. So I don't think these convictions will change their minds. But at least whenever they say that Antifa won't exist, well, I mean, I can direct them to the guilty pleas and the stipulated facts. And then you can read what those who have pleaded guilty admitted to.
Well, that's the interesting part. And I think it's 2 separate fights, right? Changing the American people's hearts and minds over what Antifa is and the threat that they pose. That's sort of one fight. And you're correct. The mainstream media obviously just runs cover for Antifa. They're like, Antifa's an idea. They're the wind. They don't exist. We know the mainstream media is propagandists. And this is like evil propaganda level to cover for actual terrorists. But the legal precedent that is set by not just the convictions, but the stipulated facts, if you are looking at, the FBI and the Department of Justice, the Trump administration, the State Department actually taking action against Antifa. We've had a lot of, those of us who talk about Antifa have had a lot of discussions behind the scenes, like, how do you actually dismantle Antifa? What's the best strategy? Because of what a convoluted structure they operate within, sort of under the umbrella of these other radical leftist groups. They do trainings for Antifa militants, but they have this plausible deniability because they're not necessarily members on the roster. They get money because they co-host events, or they are just mobilized together, but they do try to camouflage themselves by not having like an official, like, incorporated LLC type of structure so that they can avoid being dismantled. But when it comes to the most effective way of actually dismantling not just the ideology, but these individuals who are obviously part of this coordinated structure committing violence against the country, how significant of a legal precedent is it to have these stipulated facts, these statements that the defendants who pleaded guilty agreed were accurate and signed their names to?
So I'm not sure if it sets precedent in the courts, but it may set precedents in the current Department of Justice, in that they are not afraid of shying away from using the word Antifa in press releases, criminal indictments, and making sure, particularly like those who have been handling it in the Northern District of Texas have been amazing in that, like in the stipulated facts, for example, they could have not included Antifa. They could have just said that this was a violent extremist group, something like that. We typically saw language like that, or even none of that included in prior plea deals at the federal level involving far less violent extremists. But no, in this case, it was like the Antifa ideology was mentioned specifically and clearly at the beginning of the stipulated facts. And also, I need to mention that these are people who are not being convicted of terrorism crimes because of ideology or speech. They admitted to being part of a cell that carried out an ambush shooting on an ICE facility in the Fort Worth area of Texas on the 4th of July. They used fireworks to lure out officers and agents and staff inside the ICE building, and then fired upon them. And one local police officer was shot in the neck. So this is not about ideology. It's about acts of domestic terrorism.
Yeah, the ideology is the motivating force, but it's not their belief system that they're being convicted for. It's the violence that they committed. You also, in your article, talk about the defense fund that raised, the International Antifa Defense Fund, that raised money for these defendants who pled guilty in this terror case. Talk to me about that, because that's something that I think I was unsure when the Trump administration started talking about designating Antifa as a terror group. Well, how are you going to do this? Are you going to call them a foreign terror organization because there are affinity groups all around the world, because the Antifa ideology didn't originate here? How are you going to connect that? You'd have to have a financial connection to the affinity groups here in the United States in order to designate them as international or as a foreign terror organization. If you designate them as a domestic terror organization, what power does that give you to dismantle them? I was a little bit unsure about how they were going to step around that. But talk to me about the international money that's flowing to these individuals and the implications of that.
So most of the funding for organized militant Antifa cells and their riots is done through what they call mutual aid, which is their fancy word for basically crowdfunding. They're extremely good at that. And it's not even particularly hidden. They will set up Cash Apps and Venmos and campaigns on GoFundMe or a number of other sites and distribute these links online across their vast online networks, and the money comes pouring in. Most of that is domestic. However, there is an international element to some of those who have been involved in Antifa violence at the international level. For example, there's a group called Antifa International, and one of the projects they run is the International Antifa Defense Fund. I wrote about them years ago in my book about Antifa because I saw, there's a case of prosecution of Antifa in this part of America or in Europe or in this other country. And they had their hands all over it in providing funding for the legal aid in that. And I wanted to know a bit more about how they work. And if you go on the blog for Antifa International, you can see that some of the members that they've highlighted have been individuals who have gone abroad to do terrorism training. Like they will actually post pictures of them holding up weapons of war and various firearms in places like Syria to show that their members have been trained at the military level to kill. So I mentioned to the White House at the roundtable that the foreign terror organization is very important because it's at the State Department that they could, for example, ban Antifa International. Now, so far, that has not been one of the groups that has been banned out of the four. However, it's my understanding through my sources that the four that have been banned so far are not going to be the only ones. So we'll wait and see. Antifa International and the defense fund that they run did provide funding to the legal defense of the 18 defendants so far in this North Texas Antifa terror case. And we don't know who these international people are, foreign people who's providing money. And there's also a Give, Send, Go that's being operated for the Antifa terror defendants. And now some of them are convicts as well.
Which is, again, I can't help but juxtapose the facts against what the mainstream media always tells us. And it's not just the mainstream media. Elected Democrats say the same thing. Antifa is just an idea. They're a decentralized network. This is just grassroots. This is just people that have grievances against the government. Yeah, the international figures, you don't even know who they are sending money to defend acts of terror in the United States. That is not a decentralized network. That's just an idea that doesn't exist. I want to ask you too about another group. You've talked a lot about this group, and we covered this briefly a couple weeks ago on the Liz Wheeler show. We talked about, when you see an Antifa riot, especially outside of an ICE facility, you'll often see off to one side a group of individuals wearing green helmets. And the significance of those green helmets are those are members of the National Lawyers Guild, and they essentially serve Antifa. When these Antifa militants commit crimes, they are there to observe, to video, to try to accuse police of police brutality. They basically are there to try to get Antifa militants off when Antifa militants commit crimes. And it is not just one or two or three of these people. This is an entire group. Can you talk to me about that group and who's behind that group and how exactly they're coordinated? Every time that Antifa turns out to riot, these green helmeted people are always there.
So the National Lawyers Guild is an old American legal organization. They're probably most well known for providing legal aid to accused communists historically in the US. And then in recent years, they become known for being basically the legal arm of Antifa rioters. What they do is they show up at direct actions and riots, not to legally observe, which is what it says on their hats. What they're there to do is to provide legal support to their fellow comrades. And they've published on their own, not on their blog, on their website, and they're registered 501c3, by the way, with chapters at legal programs across universities across the US. They say that they don't condemn political violence or the use of violence in regards to the Antifa. So they are on record supporting criminal conduct whilst being legal observers and lawyers. So they exist to provide aid for anti-government causes and in support of the violent far left. Their latest project now is they've launched a website providing legal guidelines for how those in the military may be able to engage in seditious behavior by not following orders, for example. And they're laying out, this is sort of a blueprint for how you can argue that what you're doing is following the Constitution. So they exist to subvert. And when they're there years ago when I observed them on the ground, they wear neon green helmets. I thought that these were volunteers who were just trying to be independent observers for what was happening in a very volatile situation at riots. Then I noticed that their cameras were never directed at those who were engaging in criminal activity, like starting fires, and those who were beating people. The cameras were intentionally withheld and then only brought out and aimed directly at police whenever police showed up. And that was for the purpose, was for gathering so-called evidence so that they could engage in lawfare. If there were arrests, then they could sue cities and allege police brutality or unlawful arrests. And as I've written about before, that strategy is used to fund the rioting. A lot of how rioters are paid are through these lawsuits, because in liberal jurisdictions, they just settle. The city, the police department will not take it to trial. They'll pay out tens of millions to settle these mass lawsuits, and then those who are engaged in rioting get a payout. And that's the legacy, by the way, of the George Floyd BLM Antifa riots from 5 years ago.
It's unbelievable. The connections between the different plots that the left has or is actively engaging in right now is also, it just blows my mind on a daily basis. I mean, literally on the show yesterday, we talked about this video that was made by these 6 members of Congress, starring Senator Mark Kelly. Trump's been calling them the seditious 6 because in this video, they're encouraging military members to not comply with what they allege are unlawful orders without ever specifying what order they consider to be unlawful. It's obviously just trying to turn the military against the commander in chief. We talked about what that actually is, that it's these 6 members of Congress are all swamp creatures. They're either military, intel, national security apparatus, like deep state swamp creatures, and they are trying to foment a color revolution. An important part of a color revolution is to turn the military against the executive branch, the commander in chief, that chain of command. But it's wild to hear you talk about the National Lawyers Guild, this legal apparatus that defends Antifa and provides part of their funding through this lawfare, that they were actually the ones that wrote this blueprint, the playbook for the script that the seditious 6 spoke on this video. I think it was November 11th, the National Lawyers Guild released this blueprint telling military members to disobey orders. And then a week later, it's not a coincidence that it was only a week later that these members of Congress put out this same video. It is all so interconnected that, like I said, sometimes I have to do a double take at the connections because I'm like, really? That's connected to that? It's wild. Let me ask you this, and I know that this is a very open-ended, very big picture question, but when it comes to actually dismantling these violent radical leftist groups that adhere to Antifa ideology, even if the name of their particular group doesn't include Antifa, because oftentimes they have very vague names. If you're advising the Trump administration how to actually dismantle these groups, not play whack-a-mole and just convict people when they've committed violence, that's good, that's fine, that's serving justice, but we need to stop it before it starts, before it happens. What do you advise the Trump administration to do? Do you advise them to go after the leadership structure, the participants, the finances? How do we actually dismantle this apparatus?
Wow. Well, it would be extremely challenging just because of the fact that you said it basically is whack-a-mole. They can mobilize in a very nebulous form as masked anonymous individuals or as those who form under a number of organization names that don't have Antifa in it. I would say immediately what can be done that doesn't require a huge amount of brainstorming and creativity is for the federal prosecutors to take on the cases, as many as they can. Don't leave it in the hands of the local state prosecution. I mean, in some places, the local prosecutions can do an amazing job, like in Texas, but that's not primarily where Antifa are active and violent. They thrive in places like Portland or Seattle in other jurisdictions like that because they know they can depend on the DA being politically pressured by the city to obscure the Antifa aspects of their organized crime or to choose to not prosecute them. So immediately, I think it's just about the DOJ prosecuting and keeping it in there, making these federal cases. So I was encouraged that Pam Bondi's took an interest, for example, in what happened a few weeks ago at the University of California, Berkeley, that jurisdiction fell in the Bay Area, but in their hands, nothing would happen. There's been a lot of rioting for almost a decade on that campus and in the surrounding areas by these same groups, like By Any Means Necessary, which is an Antifa group. So where any potential federal crimes have been committed, then the federal prosecutors need to take it. And I think that will do a big immediate dent.
Will that cause a deterrent effect? And I've been unsure of the answer to that question, because when you have ideologues, oftentimes they're willing to kill and be killed. They are not deterred by the punishment for the crime they commit, because they believe it's almost a mission-oriented ideological thing that they're doing. But do you believe that terror convictions like the one that we saw in Texas, will that have a deterrent effect?
I think it will, because we're seeing that now already in Portland, Oregon. So back in June and July, that was sort of the height of the rioting outside the ICE facility. But as more and more federal agents were surged there, and the federal attorney for the District of Oregon has been charging suspect after suspect. There's been dozens who have been charged at the federal level now, and these cases are not being dropped, by the way, including for lesser crimes in the past that they wouldn't have prosecuted, like trespass or disobeying a lawful order, things like that. It's made a lot of the rioters think twice about going back and trying to set the building on fire or assaulting other federal agents. Also, some of the Antifa chatter from the organized groups is they're afraid to go out because they know that area is heavily surveilled. So there is a deterrent effect. And you're right that they do, amongst the most extreme ideologues, believe that their cause is to kill, and if needed, to be martyred in the process as well. But when they're actually faced with a situation where they could be facing years or decades in federal prison, a lot of them have stepped back.
Their ideology wavers in the face of reality. Well, I think that's good for the Department of Justice to know as well. Last question about just this dismantling. Are there particular individuals that the Department of Justice would do well to go after that would have a sort of breakdown effect in the Antifa network, or particular affinity groups that take a leadership role that if they were dismantled, it would similarly cause this sort of trickle-down dismantling effect?
Yes, I've discussed this publicly. So one of the financiers of the International Antifa Defense Fund, and this is in his own words, by the way, this is not my allegation, is a Rutgers history professor named Mark Bray. Mark Bray is probably the most well-known spokesperson for violent Antifa, I would say. Whenever he's been interviewed now for going back to 2017, it's to give the Antifa position as well as to give justifications for the violence. And if you read his book, the Antifa Handbook, where he says that proceeds from that book will go to the Antifa Defense Fund, he also uses words like "we" to describe things about direct action. So he includes himself as a member and part of this violent movement. And he says that the goal in it is, if needed, to use violence to make those who have supported Donald Trump think twice about it. And he uses the word "we." So after the executive orders were signed recently by President Trump in relation to Antifa and far-left violent extremism, he fled out of the U.S. He says it was because he received threats online. I think that was a pretense. He went to Spain, which has a socialist government right now, and the timing is quite convenient that he left the U.S. as the State Department and the intelligence community is probing the international ties between Antifa terror groups domestically and those abroad.
And he should be one, you suggest, that the Trump administration pursues.
Well, if Antifa International becomes designated as a specially designated terrorist group or an FTO, then it would legally ban providing material support to it. And he has provided money to one of their projects, which is that defense fund. So,
seems like, in a sense, it seems like an easy win for the Department of Justice to significantly dismantle the structure. I mean, the structure, unfortunately, has been very successful. We've seen this violence erupt in cities across the country. You know this. I said this to you off air before we started, but you came on my show in 2019 after you had been assaulted by Antifa, after you had suffered a traumatic brain injury, a brain hemorrhage. And Andy, it caused me pain to hear you speak after that, because you were so injured. It was hard for you to form words. It was hard for you to communicate, and to see how much you've healed, and how clearly all that you speak now, that the effects of that that you've overcome those, that violence, that assault on you. It makes me I'm so happy for you. I'm so glad, but you're also such a powerful force in educating everybody about Antifa through your courage in infiltrating these places and going and seeing and reporting on the reality. Again, I know I mentioned this at the beginning of the show, but guys, you have to read his book. Highly recommend. It's called Unmasked. You can find it anywhere books are sold. Also, make sure you subscribe to Andy's Substack. It's a pun. It's called Ngo Comment, NGOcomment.com. But all the stuff he's talking about, he writes endlessly about. He's the source of much of my knowledge about Antifa. That's what I will say. So highly recommend it. Andy, thank you for being on the show. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for being a friend to me and on this story now for so many years.
Of course, my pleasure. You're welcome back anytime. You know this. We'll talk soon. All right, guys, we have big breaking news. Just released a moment ago. It's quite shocking, actually. I'm gonna read you that breaking news headline in just a moment. But first, I want to give a big shout out to today's sponsor, All Family Pharmacy. The Black Friday buy one, get one sale is here at All Family Pharmacy. It's one of the most practical, common sense offers you'll see this entire season. From November 24th through December 2nd, that means right now, when you buy one ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, or medbendazole, you receive another one for free. Listen, taking responsibility for your health is not political. It's simply the right thing to do. And having access to trusted medications that, sometimes face gatekeeping from the medical and political elite, that matters now more than ever. All Family Pharmacy exists to make this process simple for you. Go to allfamilypharmacy.com/Liz. You just place your order online, then a licensed physician reviews it. Once it's approved, your medication ships directly to your door with privacy and reliability. This Black Friday event lasts only 1 week and supplies are limited. When the inventory is gone, it's gone. If you value preparation, clarity, and the freedom to make informed choices, visit allfamilypharmacy.com/Liz before December 2nd and make sure you secure your Black Friday buy one, get one off deal. All right, we have big breaking news that just dropped, so we're going to interrupt our regular programming to bring you this breaking news. Prosecutors have officially dropped the 2020 election interference case against President Trump and his co-defendants in Georgia. You remember the case, the mugshot, the mugshot of President Trump, that case. The prosecutor has decided to drop the case. This, according to NBC News. The Georgia prosecutor who took over the 2020 election interference case after Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis was disqualified said in a statement Wednesday he's dropping the charges against President Donald Trump and his co-defendants. Quote, "In my professional opinion, the citizens of Georgia are not served by pursuing this case in full for another 5 to 10 years, Prosecutor Pete Skandalakis wrote, saying he was ending the case to, quote, serve the interests of justice and promote judicial finality. He said the decision is, quote, not guided by a desire to advance an agenda, but is based on my beliefs and understanding of the law. Trump's defense lawyer, Steve Sadow, praised the decision in a statement saying, quote, the political persecution of President Trump by disqualified DA Fani Willis is finally over. This case should never have been brought. A fair and impartial prosecutor has put an end to this lawfare. That is the information that we know at this time. Listen, you could make an argument. I think that this would be my position. You could make an argument that this entire witch hunt against President Trump. I mean, look at that. Look at that mugshot on the screen right now. Look at that. Have you ever seen such an epic mugshot? I would argue that this lawfare against President Trump in Georgia actually served Trump. It turned in Trump's favor. Trump was the one who gained everything from this lawfare. It was intended, of course, to hurt Trump. It was intended to humiliate him, to create this, this aura of criminality. No, he's a convict. He committed a crime. We're going to put him in prison. We're going to prevent him from being president. It was an assault on a duly elected president because they didn't like him by the resistance. But what did it turn out to be? It turned out to produce this mugshot, the most epic mugshot in the history of mugshots. Do you remember the day after this mugshot was released? I have never seen anything go so viral on X ever. Nothing. It was the single biggest fundraising day for President Trump in his political history. I think it was only outdone by the day and the day after the attempted assassination attempt against President Trump, which of course came after this mugshot. This mugshot caused people, American citizens in our country who didn't even like President Trump, who were, maybe they didn't like his mean tweets. They didn't like the way that he spoke. They just weren't huge fans. It caused them to feel sympathy for him and to side with him because they looked at this and they thought, this is just judicial lawfare. This is just lawfare to try to subvert the voters. This is unfair. It's unjust. It's wrong. It's immoral. That was the attitude, not just from you and me, but from people in this country who didn't even like Trump to begin with. I would argue, and now the charges have been dropped. Now it's been totally dropped because it was bogus to begin with. And by the way, the Democrats were exposed, Fani Willis, exposed as being entirely corrupt, ridiculous, embarrassing hacks. In every single way that you could measure this, President Trump turned this lawfare into a win for himself and the American people. I'm not saying that it's a good thing that this lawfare happened. I'm not saying that I'm glad it happened. I'm not saying that I ever want to see it happen again, but it's certainly a lesson in how to, what is that cliche? Make lemonades out of lemons. Like this is the textbook example of that. His campaign raised $9.4 million in the days following the release of his mugshot. That was, of course, on August 24th of 2023. Oh my goodness. That included $7.1 million in just the first 48 hours alone. Yeah, because we all saw this and we thought this is such a gross miscarriage of justice that we are not going to tolerate it, regardless of what some people thought of President Trump himself. And by the way, it also marked Trump's return to X. It's the perfect expression. It shows authority. It shows power. It shows righteous anger. Like you look at that man and you have not subdued your political opposition. You have lit a fire within him. It was the perfect expression. And now, of course, this case has been dropped. As it should. It never should have been brought in the first place. Okay, yesterday on the show, if you haven't watched yesterday's episode, I highly recommend that you watch it. We talked about the Seditious Six video put out by 6 members of Congress. A lot of us have seen headlines about the Seditious Six, but if you want to truly understand what was behind that video and this new plot that the Democrats have to try to target President Trump, yet again, another one of their phony attacks, just like the Fulton County prosecution and that mugshot, just like the phony Ukraine impeachment, just like Russia, it's happening again. The beginnings of one of their attacks are happening again. And we unpacked that with Jack Posobiec on yesterday's episode as it relates to Senator Mark Kelly and that Seditious Six video. Well, fast forward to today, a prediction that Jack made as we were dissecting this video, a prediction that Jack made on the show yesterday. He said, this is what's going to happen in the days and weeks to come. It already came true. It actually came true this morning. So let me back up just a second. Jack and I were discussing why exactly these 6 members of Congress would be encouraging members of our military to disobey what they are alleging to be unlawful orders. It's essentially telling members of our military or planting the idea that they should be disobedient to their chain of command, especially their commander-in-chief, being President Trump, of course, as chief executive. And they didn't name any orders that they believed to be unlawful. They were just sowing the seeds of a mutiny against President Trump. And the reason that they're doing this is the same the same reason that they always do this, because they want to take out a duly elected president. They don't respect your vote and my vote. They don't respect the will of the people. They don't respect democracy. They don't respect our republic. They want to remove President Trump from power, even though he won the election. The majority of people, not just the electoral votes, the majority of the popular vote was cast for President Trump. They can't stand it because they hate him and they want to try to take him out. They want to impeach him again, just like they did in his first term. They constantly tried to hamstring his administration with impeachments. And the way that they're doing that this time is they're trying to foment this color revolution. Again, if you haven't watched the episode yesterday, go back. Jack details exactly the playbook of a color revolution, how these intel services, or in this case, the deep state swamp creatures in Congress, who are former intel officers, how they use propaganda campaigns or psyops against people to foment this idea that the American people should turn against a duly elected government and unseat the government, not using our voting system, our election system, to pick our representatives. Well, Jack said yesterday on the show that what we're going to see next after this Seditious Six video is he predicted that we would see the leak of a phone call readout similar to the leak that predicated the Ukraine impeachment. Remember that? When Donald Trump in his first term was on the phone with Ukrainian president, ironically, Zelensky, and he was talking about Joe Biden and what Hunter Biden and Joe Biden were doing in Ukraine. And this readout of this highly classified phone call between Trump and Zelensky was leaked by the quote unquote national security apparatus. And, you know, the Democrats and the mainstream media went wild, acting as though Donald Trump was engaging in some illegal quid pro quo with this conversation, which, by the way, was not even remotely scandalous, with Zelensky. And it resulted in the impeachment of Donald Trump, though not the conviction, though no conviction in the Senate. And Jack Posobiec said yesterday on the show that we're going to see that again, that the Democrats are going to use this same playbook, because even though it didn't result in a conviction in the Senate, it did result in an impeachment in the House, and it was successful in using political capital from the Trump administration, hamstringing their ability to be successful for a prolonged period of time as they fought back against these phony allegations. Jack said we're going to see the national security swamp, the blob, as Mike Benz calls it, leak another such transcript to try to falsely accuse President Trump of doing something impeachable, so that if and when the Democrats take over Congress at the midterm elections next year, they're all teed up for an impeachment. This is what Jack said specifically yesterday. Take a listen.
You mentioned color revolution. One of the things that I think that we could absolutely see again is go back to the first term. When the first impeachment of President Trump happened in 2019, it was regarding leaks from a phone call, believe it or not, with Ukraine and the president of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky. So in that case, you had Alexander Vindman, who was an army officer. You had the CIA officer, Eric Charamella, that was detailed to President Trump's White House and the National Security Council. I've said that I think what they're trying to do is gin this up again. They're trying to get someone, probably at the very least, get someone to start leaking classified information, national security information, like, I don't know, the current peace negotiations between the United States, Ukraine, and Russia, leak that out to try to gin up yet another impeachment of President Trump. And if the Democrats are able to be victorious in taking back the House, many people think that that's a possibility for 2026, then this will be something that they have on the shelf ready to go day one. I think there's a plot afoot. I absolutely think that it's a color revolution designed to overthrow the sitting commander-in-chief, the President of the United States.
Less than 24 hours after that aired late yesterday afternoon, early evening. This morning, Jack's prediction came true. We were greeted this morning with a leak of a classified phone call, or I would assume it was classified, a transcript of a phone call between Vladimir Putin's senior foreign policy advisor and Steve Witkoff, who is President Trump's special envoy. This was published by Bloomberg, and the readout of this this phone call between Witkoff and Putin's senior foreign policy advisor is being presented in exactly the same way as that phone call between President Trump and Zelensky was presented all those years ago. But if I before we even analyze it, I want to read you this transcript. Then I want to show you the reaction from the Trump haters and exactly how they're positioning this transcript. But that reaction has to be juxtaposed with you reading or hearing what exactly was said in this transcript. Otherwise, it might be too easy to assume that the way that the mainstream media is describing this transcript is accurate. We want to know exactly what was said. We don't want someone else to describe it to us. So here's what it was said. Steve Witkoff said, Yuri, here's what I would do, my recommendation. Yuri says, yes, please. Witkoff said, I would make the call and just reiterate that you congratulate the president, he's talking about President Trump, on this achievement, that you supported it, that you respect, that he's a man of peace, and you're really glad to have seen it happen. So I would say that. I think from that, it's going to be a really good call. Because let me tell you what I told the president. I told the president that the Russian Federation has always wanted a peace deal. That's my belief. I told the president I believe that. And I believe the issue is that we have two nations that are having a hard time coming to a compromise. And when we do, we're going to have a peace deal. I'm even thinking that maybe we set out like a 20-point peace proposal, just like we did in Gaza. We put a 20-point Trump plan together that was just 20 points for peace. And I'm thinking maybe we do the same thing with you. My point is this. The Russian, Yuri, then says, okay, my friend, I think that very point our leaders could discuss. Hey, Steve, I agree with you that he will congratulate. He, and he's talking about Putin, of course, he will say that Mr. Trump is a real peace man and so and so. That he will say. Witkoff says, but here's what I think would be amazing. Yuri says, okay. Witkoff says, what if, hear me out. Yuri says, I will discuss that with my boss and then I come back to you, okay? Witkoff says, yeah, because listen to what I'm saying. I just want you to say, maybe just say this to President Putin because, I have the deepest respect for President Putin. Yuri says, yes. Witkoff says, maybe he says to President Trump, Steve and Yuri discussed a very similar 20-point plan to peace, and that could be something that we think might move the needle a little bit, open to these sort of things, to explore what it's going to take to get a peace deal done. Now, me to you, I know what it's going to take to get a peace deal done. Donetsk and maybe a land swap somewhere. But I'm saying instead of talking like that, let's talk more hopefully, because I think we're going to get a deal here. And I think, Yuri, the president will give me a lot of space and discretion to get to that deal. Yuri says, I see. Witkoff says, so if we can create the opportunity that after this, I talked to Yuri and we had a conversation, I think that this could lead to big stuff. Yuri says, okay, that sounds good. Witkoff says, and here's one more thing. Zelensky is coming to the White House on Friday. Yuri says, I know that, and chuckles. Witkoff says, I will go to that meeting because they want me there, but I think, if possible, we have the call with your boss before that Friday meeting. Yuri says, before, yeah? Witkoff says, correct. Yuri says, okay, I got your advice. So I discuss that with my boss, and then I come back to you, okay? Witkoff says, okay, Yuri, I'll speak to you soon. Yuri says, great, thank you so much, thanks you. And Witkoff says, bye-bye. That is the entirety of the transcript. Now, the left and even some on the neocon right are framing this as some kind of great scandal. They're saying President Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, has advised the Russian government, has given advice to Vladimir Putin on how to coerce Trump into agreeing to a certain peace plan. And I just want to say right now, you heard those words. There's nothing remotely scandalous about anything that was said in that call. The scandal, of course, is that this call was leaked to Bloomberg and that this was released publicly. That is a bad faith move by a bad actor. And we should figure out who leaked that to Bloomberg, because it will be detrimental to actually creating a peace deal, which honestly, a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine, by the way, which is honestly probably the intent of whoever leaked it. because the globalists, as you know, don't want an end to the war between Ukraine and Russia. And that's probably the motivation for leaking that call. But this idea that Steve Witkoff was advising Vladimir Putin on how to coerce Trump is just the stupidest take that I've ever heard. The absolute stupidest. President Trump is not only a good negotiator, he's a good negotiator because he negotiates at a very high level, but he uses very basic negotiation techniques and tactics. One of the most effective negotiation tactics when you have something that you want the other party to agree to is to make the other party think that your idea is their idea. That is what you're seeing play out with Steve Witkoff. And anybody who has any knowledge of even the basic level of negotiation recognizes that instantly. Steve Witkoff, obviously not of his own volition, this is something that was most likely highly strategized behind the scene, wants to propose a 20-point peace plan between Russia and Ukraine. But he needs it to be, he needs the Russians to believe that it was their idea, not just something that they agreed to. And so he's presenting this idea to Putin's foreign policy advisor to present to Putin, for Putin to present to Trump so that Putin feels that it's his idea. That's it. That's the analysis. It's not scandalous. Imagine thinking that it's scandalous to want peace and to make an effort to procure peace. That's what the left, it's not just the left, by the way. Adam Kinzinger, former Republican Congressman Adam Kinzinger, reposted this transcript, and this repost of this transcript, this comment from Adam Kinzinger, has 750,000 views on X. And he goes, this is absolutely traitorous behavior. Absolutely traitorous behavior. Oh, are you talking about leaking such a call? Is that the traitorous behavior that you're talking about? Are you interested in the traitor that engaged in that behavior? No, you're not. Of course he's not. He's doing exactly what they did. It's the same playbook that they leveraged against President Trump during President Trump's first term, where they took that call, that readout of that phone call between President Trump and Vladimir Zelensky. And even though the readout of the phone call, which wasn't a transcript, by the way, it was just someone's opinion, it was someone's perception of that conversation between Trump and Zelensky. And they released it, but they framed it as if it was something different. And that's exactly what you'll see. I mean, look at this Adam Kinzinger post. He reposts this account that says, Witkoff attempts to coach the Kremlin on how to more easily coerce the president. That's their headline. That's how they're describing this. But you just listened to the transcript. You just read it. Is that what happened? Is that an accurate representation of this phone call? No, of course not. Of course not. And you don't have to be a mainstream media journalist to see that. You can read it for yourself. But this is what they're trying to do. They're trying to present the Trump administration as it's the same old allegation. Russia. Putin's controlling Trump. It's the Trump administration, the people around him trying to convince Putin how to better control Trump to get the outcome that he wants. Why? So that if the Democrats, God forbid, take back the House and the Senate in 2026, which we have a year, and we better work hard to make sure that doesn't happen, so that they can have an impeachment all teed up. But an impeachment based on what? Based on phony allegations. Maybe this time, I hope this time, thanks to the fact that the new media, especially the new media on the right, has broken the monopoly of the mainstream media. You can actually have access to the truth, to accurate information. It's not just entirely gatekeeping from the mainstream media that determines what you hear or what you don't hear. Thanks to Elon Musk and X, you can always find the truth on X because there's not censorship anymore. Maybe this playbook won't be effective this time because we not only recognize what it is, we are not as quick to believe anymore as Americans what any of our elected officials, what our government, what our media tells us anymore. We now question what we hear. And when you analyze this yourself and don't just take the word of the mainstream media and elected representatives or fools like neocons like Adam Kinzinger, you'll see for yourself there's nothing remotely scandalous about that readout of that phone call. It's not at all what the mainstream media is portraying it to be. And it's exactly what Jack Posobiec predicted would happen on this show yesterday. It's exactly in line with the playbook of how the left, who cannot resign themselves to the fact that the majority of the American people voted for Donald Trump because we want him to be our president. They cannot resign themselves to that. And they are, by hook or by crook, trying, and they will continue to try to take him out. Only this time, we're not going to let them. All right, guys, make sure you're subscribed to this show, youtube.com/Liz Wheeler, x.com/Liz_Wheeler on Spotify. We're the Liz Wheeler Show. Hit subscribe. If you could, leave us a 5-star review. I greatly appreciate that. Listen, happy Thanksgiving. I hope you have a wonderful little respite from the cares, all the heavy topics that we talked about today. I hope you have a little vacation from that and spend some good quality time with your family, eating good food together. We will be back on Monday, as I assume you will as well. But I am also going to enjoy some good time and some good food with my family tomorrow and over the weekend. So thank you for sitting here with me today. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. I'm Liz Wheeler. This is The Liz Wheeler Show.